I want to welcome everyone to the Pacific Seminar Series with the Australian Centre for Pacific Islands Research. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Bridget Horsey and I'm going to be hosting the seminar for you today. We are really fortunate to have Professor George Curry and Associate Professor Gina Koczberski presenting on their presentation, which is titled, How Does Technology Adoption Interact with Socio-Cultural Change Amongst Smallholder Farmers in Papua New Guinea? Now, Professor George Curry is a geographer at Curtin University, though most of his research has been in rural PNG, examining socio-cultural and economic change associated with modernisation and the transition to a market economy at the household and community levels. He uses sustainable livelihoods approaches to investigate how export cash cropping and labour migration are accommodated within quasi-subsistence economies where Indigenous relations of production and exchange and communal land tenure are still strong. And Associate Professor Gina Koczberski, and I do apologise, Gina, I meant to check to make sure I was pronouncing your name properly then. Gina is a geographer and a senior researcher fellow at Curtin University as well. And she has over 25 years of research and fieldwork experience in PNG, working on issues around internal migration and migrant livelihoods, land tenure, agricultural and rural change, gender and smallholder production and livelihood practices. Since 2000, she's been involved in several research projects examining socio-economic change in smallholder oil palm, coffee and cocoa production in PNG, with an emphasis on examining how changing demographic, economic and social circumstances influence household gender relations of production and strategies of commodity crop production. And of course, both George and Gina are also members of the Pacific Livelihoods Research Group. And we, as I said before, we're very fortunate that they have offered to share their time with us today. So welcome, Gina and George. And I suppose just before I do hand it over to you, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you do have questions, we will have time for questions at the end and you can pop them into the chat. But otherwise, I won't hold up any more time and I'll let Gina and George take it from here. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bridget, for that very nice welcome to the presentation, and thanks for the Centre for Pacific Islands Research and inviting us to present in your seminar series. We really appreciate that. I'll just start by saying that the presentation really draws on over 30 years of research, so it's going back a long time, you know, and 30 years of experience working with smallholders. And many of the ideas and arguments, oh, sorry, I want to share the screen. That might.
Yeah, perfect.
Is that looking okay?
Yeah, that's working good now.
Okay. So we've spent quite a long time there and a lot of collaboration with PNG researchers. We should just acknowledge some of the key people we've worked with, like Ruben Singeri, Stephen Naki, Veronica Boo, Joachim Lamani, Matilda Hamago, Manu Gurma, Cecily Peter, Robert Nailina, and Susan Mayina from those three crops, cocoa, coffee, and oil palm. And so part of the research that we're presenting today was conducted in association with their institutions, like the PNG Coconut Institute, the PNG Oil Palm Research Association, the Oil Palm Industry Corporation, and the Coffee Industry Corporation, as well as, Unitech, PNG Unitech. So we've, as you know, there's been much research has documented the highly diverse, flexible, and adaptive farming systems in PNG. And agriculture in PNG has been adapted to a wide range of environments, from the high altitude zones of the Central Highlands to small islands with poor soils. The adaptability of PNG farming systems largely explain why, despite many colonial interventions in agriculture, the incorporation of export tree crops, and a history of short-term shocks and long-term stressors on food and economic systems, food and availability and livelihood security have remained adequate for most rural households. Today, about 83% of food energy and 76% of protein consumed in PNG comes from locally sourced foods. So this achievement is in the context of a 4.5-fold increase in population since 1950. And that reflects not only people's relatively good access to land and the role of social relationships in maintaining resilience, but importantly, the capacity and willingness of rural villages to innovate and adapt to changing circumstances. So it's very important to have that idea that agriculture in PNG is not static. Lots of innovation is going on. As you're sure you know, Sustainable Development Goal 2 is zero hunger by 2030. That's a huge logistical and technological challenge for the world, given the nature of global food production and the demands of an ever-growing world population. Of the approximately 608 million farms worldwide, 84% are less than 2 hectares and rely mainly on family labor, and they account for 35% of the world's food supply. So the smallholder, the small farm sector is crucial in all of this. Amongst other objectives under Sustainable Development Goal 2 is a call for a doubling of smallholder productivity by 2030, not far long to go. So this requires agricultural intensification on a massive scale. The small size of these farms and their limited resources, particularly access to labor, technology, and financial capital, means that such productivity increases are going to be extremely difficult to make and will be dependent on the adoption of a range of technologies and innovation. While adoption of technology in agriculture is fundamental to improving farm productivity, a vast literature shows that adoption levels of externally promoted technologies remain low and the pace of adoption very slow amongst small-scale farmers in developing countries. And PNG is no exception. For example, technical interventions and uptake of extension advice in smallholder oil palm, cocoa, and coffee in PNG have been very low indeed. Studies of technology adoption by women have found women face additional challenges to men in their capacity to adopt new technologies and innovations. These include local gender norms and ideologies, restrictions on mobility, poor access to formal extension channels, limited access to financial service, low savings rates, heavy workloads, limited roles in decision-making regarding household assets, insecure and limited property rights, and a lack of collective action. Despite that huge amount of research devoted to this topic, extension agencies and policymakers still struggle to understand what motivates and influences farmers to adopt or reject new technologies in their farming systems. Okay, our basic proposition is that farm families' assessment of a potential new technology is highly dependent on how that technology aligns with socio-cultural infrastructure. If viewed as socially or culturally disruptive, then introduced technologies can be resisted despite obvious material gains from adoption, such as higher returns to labor. So the context for the rest of the presentation. In many small-scale farming communities, livelihood and farming practices are structured by relations of gender, generation, and kinship. They're a huge influence on agricultural practices. Indigenous economic and social values and practices continue to shape things like land tenure arrangements, labor supply, payment of labor, investment decisions, and the production of subsistence and cash crops. Technology adoption and innovation are usually associated with modernization and development. For example, with modernization, there is generally a pull towards an emphasis on the individual, a move towards market relations, individual property rights like land tenure, and monocropping. And these sorts of transitions may not be easy to make for communities where importance is placed on the group, indigenous economic relations, collective property rights, and mixed cropping systems. Also, core components of social organization, such as gender and generational relations, can shift with modernization in ways that can be problematic to the societies because they destabilize existing moral and hierarchical orders governing relationships between individuals and groups. Disruptive innovation can challenge how people live, relate to each other socially and economically, and organize their local societies and economies. We know that a great deal of adoption and innovation occurs easily without disrupting existing social orders and values. We could consider this as incremental or passive innovation, when a new technology is viewed by farmers as an improvement in their lives without disrupting greatly the established economic, social, or political order. Such technologies can be adopted gradually in response to slow building pressures, such as population growth, when a community or society has time to adjust and to accommodate new technologies or innovations. Or they can be relatively quick, such as the high-yielding rice varieties during the Green Revolution in South and Southeast Asia. Agricultural intensification, for example, through increasing labor and other farm inputs, is usually incremental and it can occur over decades to raise productivity to keep pace with population growth. So it may not be experienced as particularly disruptive. Disruptive innovation is usually transformative, and we can think of the social, cultural, economic, and environmental dimensions. It involves new ways of combining the factors of production, following Brookfield's early work, and it's often in response to livelihood breakdown. And the other important thing is it may take a generation or more to accept. So in cases where values and ways of life are challenged by adoption, then questions arise about the factors affecting tipping points that move a society from one state to another, in which relationships, values, and agricultural practices are reevaluated and reset. Okay, now we're just going to have a look at a case study from cocoa in East New Britain. The cocoa pod borer, which arrived in 2006. On that slide, this farmer went to harvest his cocoa, harvested all the pods, cut them open, and most of them were affected by this cocoa pod borer moth. The little grub burrows in and destroys the beans. So basically, he had nothing really to harvest, nothing to sell. So in this case study, we're looking at why cocoa smallholders in East New Britain were unable or unwilling to adopt the necessary management techniques to control this devastating pest, which arrived in the province in 2006. Now, cocoa farming in a cocoa pod borer environment, I'll say CBB for now, it requires large investments of cash and labour to maintain the cocoa block and control the pest. Farmers are required to harvest all mature pods on a 7 to 10 day cycle, remove and bury infested pods, regularly prune and control shade trees, keep the site weed-free and apply insecticide. In other words, farmers have to adopt modern, high-input, capital-intensive farming methods if they are to harvest any crop at all. And then that slide, you can see just how production has basically collapsed in East New Britain. So the majority of smallholders have not been able to adopt CBB control methods for three interrelated reasons. Their inability to act on extension advice. Thousands of farmers have received training on CPB control, but few have been able or keen to adopt CPB control methods. And there's been a large World Bank project for quite a few years trying to implement this. Two, the high labour demands required to control CPB. It's a massive increase on the labour inputs before CPB. And there's this reluctance to adopt modern farming methods. So the pest incursion presented farmers with a dilemma. If they did not adopt the techniques necessary for controlling the pest, they would lose almost all their cocoa crop to the pest. But to adopt the new agricultural practices required fundamental lifestyle changes that few found acceptable. To understand why CPB control was so difficult for smallholders, we need to consider the farming system. Prior to the CPB incursion in 2006, cocoa production was what we called a low input, low output foraging production strategy, characterized by very low labor inputs. Yields of around 300 kilos of dry bean per hectare were about a third of what could have been achieved with just some basic maintenance of the cocoa block, like pruning. But returns to labor, which was almost entirely harvesting labor, not maintenance labor, were sufficient to maintain this production strategy. And the cocoa farming system enabled a broad suite of livelihood strategies and sociocultural practices to be pursued. However, that low input foraging production strategy was suddenly rendered obsolete when cocoa pod losses approached 100%. And we can see like just what was the maintenance levels on the cocoa blocks before CPB. Very little or no labor was allocated to weeding, pruning, shade control, and other maintenance tasks. So these are the results of an inspection of almost 100 blocks in 2004-2005 before CPB arrived in the province. So it's a very low input system of production. And before CPB, losses to pests and diseases were high at over 1/3 of mature pods, and harvesting was very irregular. So people tolerated high losses to pests and disease, like 30% was tolerable, but not 100%, which was the case with CPB. For most smallholders, this cocoa farming system worked well in meeting their cash needs and fitted well into their broader livelihood and socio-cultural system, which was based on labor flexibility across a diverse range of activities. But this way of life is no longer sustainable in a CPB environment because crop losses approached 100% under this low input system of production. In response to the loss of crop associated with CPB, the two immediate and most noticeable responses were reductions in household expenditure, especially of store foods, an expansion of production of garden crops for home consumption and sale at local markets. And that's something farmers were familiar with and could easily scale up. Training in CPB control, but as I said, very few have adopted the new management requirements. While locally marketed garden foods became the primary income source for both men and women, household incomes remained much below their pre-CB levels. We're not going to this figure, but it's basically a summary. Just to note that the bulk of growers did not get back to pre-CBB levels of production. These farmers tended to increase intercropping, while the very few farmers who switched to high-input farming reduced the area of cocoa, replanted with high-yielding clones, and diversified into other crops like balsa. So CBB created an existential dilemma for cocoa growers. If they did not adopt the techniques necessary for controlling CPB, they would lose almost all their crop. But to adopt the new agricultural practices meant much larger investments of family labor and capital in the cocoa plot. High-input farming was a disruptive innovation requiring major lifestyle changes incompatible with the existing cultural infrastructure or way of life. Despite the prospect of significantly lower cash incomes from not innovating, very few farmers switched to high-input cocoa farming. And now I'll hand over to Gina.
I'll have to change.
Okay. Do you want me to control the mouse?
And I can. Thank you. So this is going to be the second case study we're presenting today. So this is the last of the case studies. And this one is also from Papua New Guinea. And it presents an example of a successful adoption, unlike the cocoa pod borer case study that George just discussed. And this was a new payment system that was introduced in 1997 that paid women separately from their husbands for work that they conducted on their family oil palm plots. And this payment system was introduced in both Hoskins and Biala in Western Britain. And yet, despite the potential challenges it posed to men's authority and gender relationships in agricultural production, the new payment system for women received really strong support both from men and women. Today, the payment system continues to operate over 20 years now, and almost 10,000 women in the oil palm growing areas of Western Britain now have their own harvesting card, and this represents about 80% of female oil palm farmers. And the large majority of those that have a card have had their harvesting card for over 15 years, so it gives an indication of the stability and success of the program. The card is known locally as the Mama card, and in 2017 and 2018 we did an evaluation of the scheme to mark the 20-year anniversary, I suppose, of its operation, and that followed on from an initial evaluation we did in 2001 and 2002 that was requested by the industry because they couldn't understand why the Mama Loose Fruit Scheme was so successful, given they'd tried previously to improve the loose fruit collection, and also there'd been a whole decades of technologies that hadn't been successfully implemented in the industry. So they were keen to find out why this particular one was successful. So whilst there are some problems with the Mama card, generally it's been a huge success in benefiting women, and women now earn and control over 30 or 33% of household income from oil palm. But before I say any more about the payment scheme, I'll just give you a bit of a background to the scheme. So family oil palm harvesting in PNG has a very clear gender division of labour. And if you have a look at the top left-hand corner of the slide, you can see very tall palm. Men harvest the oil palm bunches. It's really difficult work. And when those bunches hit the ground, the small fruitlets can become dislodged and they're scattered on the ground there. And that's the job for women. The women's job is to collect that loose fruit. And they count, those small fruitlets count for about 14% of the total harvest. So prior to 97, it was only men who received payments from the milling company for both the oil palm bunches, and you can see those bunches on the right, and the loose fruit, which is at the front of the screen here. And although at the time, most of the loose fruit was left to rot on the ground, and that was largely because women weren't being paid sufficiently by their husbands, so a lot of women refused to collect the fruitlets. In 1996, this changed, or 97, sorry, this changed where they introduced the Mama card. And in the year prior to the introduction of the Mama card, the Agricultural Extension Services did a survey of the amount of wasted loose fruit, and they estimated between 60 and 70% of the loose fruit on the smallholder blocks wasn't collected. And that's largely because women resented working in the oil palm blocks. And many, by 1996, had shifted much of their labour from working in oil palm to selling food at local markets where they had more control over the income. And as one woman remarked, referring both to herself and others in the similar situation, in one of the interviews with me, said that before the card, most of the money was going to the husbands. The men weren't giving money to women before the Mama card was introduced, and because of this, women would strike. That is, they refused to help on the block. I also would strike when John, her husband, kept control of the Mama card, and those type of comments were frequently told in the interviews. So, but despite women's alternative income source from markets, there remained a lot of arguments and conflicts within families, especially between husbands and wives, over the distribution and use of the oil palm income by the father and the husband, and their failure to meet their financial obligations to the family. And these conflicts intensified over time with declining per capita income resulting from this tripling of the population on surviving off the old palm income since the early 70s. The low level of loose fruit collection was also a concern to the industry due to the substantial loss of revenue. And in the 1980s, industry efforts to improve the collection of loose fruit by women were unsuccessful. And in part, it was because they wrongly assumed that it was time and technical constraints on harvesting that was the problem. And it wasn't until 96 when the extension officers and the ACPIR, the Oil Palm Industry Corporation extension officers, talked to the women that they learned that it was the lack of financial reward for their work in collecting loose fruit and their husbands' unwillingness to share more fairly the oil palm income with their wives that explained not only women's refusal to put much effort into family oil palm production, but also explained the very high levels of family pensions that often accompanied the oil palm payments by the company to the male head of the household. And it was from stories told by the women that the extension officers then recommended to the milling company that women should be paid directly for the sale of the loose fruit. So the following year, women received their own payment card, and this is now, as I said before, known as the mama card. And there was an overwhelming interest from women to obtain their own harvesting card. And this graph shows, if the green line is the loose fruit, and as I mentioned before, loose fruit makes up about 14% of the total harvest. So the dashed line is the limit of the loose fruit collection. And so you can see before 97, there's very, very little collection of the loose fruit. And then as soon as the introduction of the card was due, or women had their own harvesting card, there's an increase in the loose fruit. But also what was happening at the same time was that when it was introduced, and the men were also encouraged to put some of the big bunches on their wives' card to give them, it was like their contribution to the family income to help the women to buy food and so on. And so we see that that women were receiving more than 14% of the total oil palm household income. And as I mentioned before, now women earn about 30% of the total household income. And this graph, just if you look at the red line, is the number of women that took up the mama card. And this is just at Hoskins. And so you can see this really rapid increase, which is quite remarkable for any type of agricultural intervention in PNG, given its history of very low intake. So I won't go read all these points here, but women have experienced a lot of benefits from having their own payment card. 73% of the women now claim that oil palm is their primary income, and that's very different to what we find in cocoa and coffee, where women still rely on market income, where they have the main control of the income. And in terms of income, in 2016, women were earning 2,038 kina a fortnight, which is very reasonable in PNG, where the minimum hourly wage, a real wage at the time, was 3 kina 50. So while there are a number of factors facilitating the successful introduction of the payment card for women, one of the primary reasons for the initial success of the scheme is is because of its capacity to address the rising social conflict between men and women over oil palm production and income. In the interviews with women and men, they talked about the prolonged arguments and loss of family social well-being. There's a notion of one bell in Papua New Guinea, which is very important, and resulting from the non-payment or underpayment of their labour. In interviews, many recalled the disputes that erupted on payday, and this was really disturbing for everyone in the family. And so it was in this very unstable and uncertain economic social environment that the mama card was welcomed by women and supported by the men, and evidence from the bunches that they were putting on to their women, their wives' harvesting cards. Because it provided families with an opportunity to resolve the ongoing arguments over household income, and most importantly, to restore relationships and reinstate social well-being, it was really a most welcomed payment card to the family. As some of these quotes show some of the benefits the card had in reducing family conflicts. And again, I won't read out all of them, but I'll let's see here the first one. Before the mama loose fruit was introduced, the family was always arguing with the father, but this stopped after its introduction. Before, women were not given their share of the income, causing arguments and violence among the family. The introduction of the card reduced such problems and brought harmony. So for the women also, the mama card opened a space for the renegotiation of gender relations within the household and for more cooperative work practices to emerge. These social benefits contributed significantly to how smallholders responded to the new payment system. In other economic and social circumstances, the direct payment of women's labour by the company could have been viewed by men as a direct challenge to gender hierarchies and to their authority. However, because gender relations had deteriorated to such a conflicted state and was experienced as such by both men and women, that the direct payment of women's labour was like an impasse that led to improved incomes overall and greater social stability within the household. And I'll leave that case study now and hand back to George, and we'll discuss this later.
Okay, we'll swap over. Oh, thank you. There's like musical chairs here. Okay, thanks, Gina. Okay, it's just bit of discussion and a quick conclusion. The socio-cultural risks associated with technology adoption occur on a continuum. Adoption and innovation can range from incremental, with minimal disturbance of the socio-cultural and environmental context, to extremely disruptive in terms of their potential to erode socio-cultural values and relationships, or long-standing markers of identity and status. Innovation experienced as socially or culturally disruptive will generate resistance because it requires fundamental changes in the habits, practices, and values of people. Disruptive innovation is therefore more likely to occur during periods of stress or shock to address what are seen as intractable problems. Surprisingly, most PNG cocoa farmers were not pushed over the threshold to adopt the new practices and values associated with a high-input cocoa cropping system. Although they were left worse off financially, they retained much of their way of life by scaling back their engagement with the cash economy and putting more emphasis on subsistence production. In this way, their socio-cultural infrastructure remained relatively intact. In contrast, the emergence of increasingly conflicted relations between men and women in oil palm was a social crisis ripe for transformation. As gender relations became more fraught, the Mama Loose Fruit Scheme offered a way out of this, and it was adopted enthusiastically by men and women, despite men having to cede to women some of their power and control in oil palm block management and income distribution. Gender relations were fundamentally transformed by this disruptive innovation, and today women are active agents in oil palm production, and as Gina said, earning 1/3 of total oil palm income. We can speculate that the situation in Western Britain was ready for this change, and in an earlier period, the Mama Loose Fruit Scheme would likely have been rejected by men because it challenged well-entrenched gender hierarchies. So just some conclusion there. On the slide there, you can see 3 levels of technology for coffee processing, from using a stone to a hand pulper to a machine that's powered by a generator. So in conclusion, the barriers to technology adoption and innovation are not simply technical, informational, nor financial. Rather, proposed technologies and innovations and the way they are introduced and presented to target communities are often incompatible with Indigenous values, habits, socio-cultural institutions, and ways of doing things that can make technology transfer challenging for farmers. In other words, resistance to adoption is much more than an issue of education levels, access to information, capital, and other financial and technical resources. Our 2 cases portray some of the dilemmas confronting smallholder families and communities in many parts of the developing world, who are faced with trade-offs between their material and socio-cultural needs. Often this trade-off involves suppressing a socio-cultural need for an urgent material need such as food production or income generation. These dilemmas arise because traditional farming systems made up of land tenure, farming practices, crops and diets are embedded in the indigenous socioeconomy, and this is where culturally valued behavioural practices are done and moral values displayed. So while a new technology might appear to offer a significant improvement in productivity and incomes, it may not always be perceived as a positive change for the community, nor for the individuals concerned. It may even be viewed as a retrograde step capable of debasing socio-cultural values, traditional practices, and moral values. As a final point, Sustainable Development Goal to double productivity by 2030 remains extremely challenging and an elusive goal. But progress towards this goal could be accelerated by working with farmers to develop technology options that are more aligned with sociocultural infrastructure and therefore more likely to be adopted. Without this alignment, much of the investment in Sustainable Development Goal 2 will continue to be futile. And if you're interested, this presentation was from this paper recently published, which is in association with some colleagues from SURAD. So there's other case studies from Africa. And we'll finish there. Thanks for your attention. And I'll stop sharing the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Gina, for that great presentation. I did find it very interesting hearing about how those different social-cultural factors influence agriculture and PNG, as I'm sure everyone else did here today. I guess we will open it up for questions now, and there was one that was put through in the chat a little bit earlier on from David, so I might start with that one if you're both happy. So David just said, thanks Gina and George. I was wondering if your estimates of farm income included remittances and what role the increasing dependence of rural villages on remittance income in Bougainville, for example, I probably said that wrong, plays in the perceived reluctance of farmers to invest in new technologies.
Thanks, that's a really good question. When we looked at the cocoa pod borer in Eastern Britain, the responses, families became very, well, to a certain extent dependent on remittances from their relatives working in town, or some of them used to go to areas where the cocoa pod borer had not yet reached and asked for harvesting rounds. So yes, people in a position to collect written remittances would be highly valued, and that would certainly affect their decision. So it's all helping, because the thing is that if an innovation is potentially disruptive to socio-cultural infrastructure, then they'll resist, and remittances will help that resistance, as would alternative income sources like markets and so on. And during the CBB in East New Britain, that happened during the global food crisis, when food prices rocketed, store food prices. So as the CBB hit and people increased the marketing, they were very fortunate in that they were able to still have a market rather than the local food market being flooded by all these cocoa growers suddenly producing food for the markets in Rabaul and Cocobolo. So that so it was lucky in the timing. But yes, if it was like if those options were not available, like the market income or remittances or other things, then they would be under more pressure to adopt it. They'd probably be forced to do so. So yeah, it's a good point.
Thanks, George. I think you gave a pretty detailed answer there, which was nice. I think that's answered that one for David. Does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to ask George or Gina? Feel free to switch on your microphone if you'd prefer to do it that way.
Could I?
Sorry.
I mean, we saw the same thing with COVID when people returned back from their town jobs. and remittance income shut down, the young people came back to the villages, and cocoa production and food crop production really increased. And now that they're going back to towns, remittance income's coming back into the villages. People aren't paying as much attention to their food crops and cocoa anymore. I think, yeah, the remittance income really contributes to that reluctance, that perceived reluctance, and the reluctance. It's a weird term because there's a bit of cultural bias. We see that farmers are reluctant to take up things that are going to be good for them. When from the farmer's perspective, they're actually making sensible business decisions and cultural decisions, and they're not reluctant. They just don't see the benefit.
That's exactly right, David. That's and that just gets repeated over and over. And I met lots of people who have been trying to introduce technologies and find it difficult to say, like, this technology, this will increase productivity. Why are people not doing it? It's but that the cultural bit often is missing, and it's just a pure straight up market analysis, like returns to labor. And in the case of those cocoa growers, I mean, major lifestyle changes would be required to sustain cocoa. So it could happen, if those other options, remittances, local market income, and those sorts of things just dried up, then people would be forced to do it.
The other thing with that attitude, David, is that with that reluctance, as you say, that we see it, or others see it as reluctance, whereas the farmers see it as a perfectly good decision. The problem with that as well for outsiders is that it's very easy then to label them as lazy. They're lazy, they're disinterested. And I'm sure you've also heard many extension officers and people working in the export industry say, "Oh, they're just lazy, or Ollie less." They're not interested. And
the problem of the extension is the farmer.
Yeah,
I know. Yeah. So there's a whole sort of set of assumptions around that idea of reluctance that really needs to be considered a lot more carefully when we look at why farmers are not adopting certain technologies. But it's a very easy conclusion to make. They're lazy, they're reluctant, they're not interested. It's like we don't get anywhere when we put it down to those levels.
Sorry, just on that point, I was just wondering, my question actually sort of, I suppose, leads onto that, is that like because I noticed George said with the training, like there was reluctance to uptake new ideas, whatever. If all the ideas had been put across by outsiders, would there be a difference if some local people were trained and then that message was portrayed by the local people rather than perceived outsiders sort of coming in and telling people what to do?
That's a good question. Yeah, some of the extension was like using local farmers, lead farmers, and all that sort of thing, and it worked. I think there's a number of farmers did make the transition to high input farming, and people were willing to do the training, and lots of them enrolled in the training. But the problem was, once they realized just how much of a commitment they had to make, how much they had to put into that work, because people have very diverse livelihoods, and they also have a really broad range of socio-cultural activities that are not actually work related, but just they put so much value on those that to suddenly become a cocoa laborer, let's say, it was just too much, of a change in their lifestyles. They'd be forced to give up a lot of things. So they were keen to keep the cocoa if it was possible, but when they realized just after the training just how much work was involved, a lot of them tried sort of changing the extension recommendations. So instead of doing weekly harvesting, they try and make the period longer. They would try to get away with less pruning and less shade control, but then the yields were just still pretty low. So it was a difficult situation for them to reach. And a lot of the people that made the transition tended to be more sort of business-minded people who employed labor, hired labor, and usually better educated and that sort of thing. And they weren't really part of the traditional economy, you know, because these village communities, they're all sort of enmeshed in all sorts of things together. So you have individuals who are more sort of business minded who are outside that sort of milieu, you know, and it was easier for them to make the change. So there's a lot to be given up.
Yeah, sorry, on David's point, it would be interesting to see if those things were introduced when there was the urban people had moved back to rural communities, if, you know, their lifestyles are slightly different, whether those people would have been more willing to take on that type of thing. Maybe,
Yeah,
I don't know.
well, that's right. They're more educated, those people that have gone off to town. In fact, that's a strategy of a lot of, especially island communities or isolated communities. They'll invest a lot in children's education, and then they'll send them to town to work and remit money. It's one of the livelihood strategies, and they're better educated and that sort of thing. So when as David said, with COVID, and they're coming back to the village, they're sort of more entrepreneurial and all that sort of thing.
Bringing new knowledge into the community or whatever.
Yeah. So whether it sticks or not is a different thing. But then again, you know, it's different value systems, and they're sort of contradict each other a bit. You know, so this emphasis on the individual for, you know, market-based transactions and all that sort of thing, whereas everybody's communal. So like usually for labor, it's all based on kinship. So it's not really like a wage labor situation. So it's difficult to make those transitions, but you know, they do happen, and if it's gradual, people can adjust. Like, you know, when wage labor comes in, it could take a generation for people to accept it, you know, rather than indigenous reciprocal labor exchange, which is the most common practice. You know, so it's just a different. Some of these issues are looked at in that paper,
Right. Yeah.
discussed in a bit more detail.
It's interesting what you're saying, George, because I do think potentially some of these entrepreneurs come back to community and they've got this new information and ways of doing things, but that potentially it's still different and it's still not accepted by the Indigenous beliefs, so it's still shut down. I mean, you would imagine that would happen.
Yeah, that's right. There's like for example, a lot of businesses, successful businesses in PNG, that it might be in town, the owner of the business will get a manager in, because then they're outside, you know, these traditional obligations which can really bring the business down. You know, obligations to provide free goods and cash, and that they put it in the hands of a manager who operates it on their behalf and therefore is able to resist all these demands. So it's yeah, it's a difficult one. And the people, when they come back after a while, you know, if they're just operating like an entrepreneur, just thinking of their own business, they'll be seen in a very negative light after a while as being greedy and selfish and not considering the community. So there's pressure on them to conform to community norms, which are not really strong in market relations. So it's very, you know, it's difficult. So the businesses that tend to succeed are ones that don't need lots of money put back into them. Like, you know, so things like trade stores are okay, cocoa fermenters are okay, because you don't have to save the money. You can get your money and just give it all away in the indigenous exchange economy, and the business will continue. But if you tried to set up a motor vehicle repair workshop, it's a different matter. You'd be broke in no time. Very, very hard to sustain. So it depends, you know, there's all these, the traditional economy really influences business activities and business success. I don't know if that addressed your question.
It's very complex, George. Well,
it is.
Yeah. Well, thank you for answering those questions. We are starting to run out of time, so I thought I'll just do a final kind of reach out if anybody else had a question before we do let George and Gina finish up.
I had a quick question. Just in terms of those two different case studies, Was there any community consultation performed prior to the interventions? And if so, was it different? And do you think that could have played a role at all in the different success stories between those two cases?
I'll talk about the mama loose fruit, and then George can maybe say something about the cocoa pod borer. But I mean, a major factor explaining the success of the mama card is the extensive community consultation that went ahead. And one of the really important things that they had to sort out before it was introduced was that the men would support the scheme. So they did a lot of consultations. They knew the women would be interested because there'd already been discussions with them, but they wanted to make sure that the men would support the scheme. And for the men, in many ways, it wasn't a loss of income, because that income from the loose fruit wasn't being paid to the men, because it just wasn't being collected. So there was a lot of consultation with the men, and it was at that stage where they encouraged the men to put some bunches on their wives' net as their contribution to the household, and also as a means of their support, showing their support for the scheme. So that was really important. And they did a trial as well. So they trialed the mama card, again, just to show both people in the community and the men as well, what changes might emerge. And so they trialed it among 10 women. And the trial was supposed to run for about 6 months, but after about 3 months, apparently the OPIC Extension Office was inundated with all these women coming down to the office saying, hang on, I want my card, I want my card. So they abandoned the trial after about 3 months and introduced it right across the Hoskins area, and then later to Biella. So that was a major factor in that successful initial introduction. But it was because they could see immediately how that had an impact on declining the number of arguments, because in PNG2, arguments are really considered problematic in terms of creating illness, creating bad feeling. It can be a reason for sorcery. It can be a reason for poor yields. So being able to overcome that through a card was really important for women and men. That's why a lot of people were willing to accept the card.
Yeah, it was
But cocoa pod borer there, I'll let George say.
well, yeah, that's what you say is true. But in the case with the oil palm, there was a real urgent need because of the conflict. And as Gina said, like conflict within a family or a group, causes all sorts of problems, like illness, sorcery, bad yields, everything. And in the cocoa case, there was one group, a company actually, who was doing some very good stuff in that. And they set up farmer discussion groups and that. There's a student just finished a thesis on it here. And it was very successful with those farmers that were involved in it. But the issue of the amount of work that needed to be done to control the pest was the big factor. So, the people got engaged, they did it for a while, and then they were looking at their total labor commitments that they had to make to it. So it was just very, very difficult. And they didn't have to, it wasn't necessary for them to make the change in the end. They could just scale back a bit their engagement in the cash economy and preserve sort of the way of life. Whereas in oil palm, it was just too much, a bit dysfunctional. So this was seen as a way to address that. So what you say is correct. There must be a lot of groundwork done before to facilitate it, and often that groundwork is not done.
Yeah, so just more so because with the cocoa pods, obviously there wasn't that sort of time to be able to do that community consultation. Is that what you're saying?
No, that was done. But once people realized how much work had to be done, like how much time they had to spend in cocoa, like they'd say, I'm not a plantation worker. Why should I adopt that? I'm not a plantation worker. I own this farm. I own this cocoa.
Yeah.
I'm not a plantation worker. That's what we often heard. They say, why don't you just implement this? You know, cocoa yields will be 1 ton a hectare. You'll triple your income.
Thanks
Yeah,
for
so
that.
that was a problem.
Thank
So
you.
Thank you.
George and Gina, I wonder if after the presentation you could share with me an email, a copy of that paper, and I might be able to share it with everyone, because I think we've got a
Sure.
few interested audience members here today that would like to have a read of that one. And I know I missed that one when I was on the slide to actually write it down.
Yeah, we'll send that to you.
Yeah, thanks, George. All right, well, I guess we might finish up there. It is 1 o'clock now. There's a few thank yous coming through in the chat, but otherwise on behalf of ACPIR and everyone here today, George and Gina, thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. I think you've given us much to consider, and we wish you all the best with your future work. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget and everyone. Really appreciate your input and comments. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Bye.